On Friday, September the 9th, 1949, Flight 108 departed Montreal at 9 a.m, right on time. The Douglas DC-3 made regular runs along the route from Quebec's largest city to the point where the St. Lawrence River widened into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The plane's final destination was a small fishing village named Sept Îles, or Seven Islands, but it would never make it there. After a stop in Quebec City, Flight 108 took off from L'Ancien-Lorette at 10:25, running about 5 minutes behind schedule. On board were 19 passengers and a crew of 4. All souls aboard the regional flight were Canadians, save for 3 American executives from the Kennecott Copper Corporation. The plane would stop next in Baie-Comeau, a paper mill town 220 miles northeast of Quebec. Sometimes the flight would make a flag stop at Forestville, a lumber town halfway between the main locales. But 10 minutes after takeoff, Captain Pierre Laurent was advised by air traffic control that he could skip the stop today. Laurent's acknowledgement of that message would be the last time he was ever heard from. At 10:45, as Flight 108 was cruising in fair weather over the Cap Tourmente National Wildlife Area, a violent explosion aboard the DC-3 shattered the craft and sent its disintegrating remains, along with the passengers on board, spiraling to the earth below. Witnesses on the ground heard what sounded like a crash of thunder and saw white smoke pouring from the plane as it veered sharply north before plummeting into a tree-covered hill. A crew of Canadian National Railway workers working at the base of the bluff were the first to arrive on the scene, climbing for nearly an hour up the 2,000-foot incline to the wreckage. The men expected to find a roaring blaze, or at least smouldering ruins of what was once a shining DC-3. Instead, they discovered no sign of fire, just the shattered remains of an aircraft that had fallen near vertically and the gruesome remains of 23 people. Among the dead were the entire crew, Captain Laurent, a 30-year-old father whose wife was expecting their second child in just a few days, First Officer Gordon Alexander, and Flight Engineer Emile Terrine, each who left wives and children behind, and veteran flight attendant Gertrude Trudy Mackay, who had just returned to work after sick leave. On the passenger manifest were the 3 American executives, Russ Parker, Earl Stannard, and Arthur Stork, bound for a tour of their company's mining assets. 24-year-old garage station owner Lionel Dallaire, Bank of Montreal inspectors Cecil Humphreys and Alfonso Keller, Ontario Paper Company men Bill Schuler and Ed Cullen, Henri Paul Bouchard with his wife and infant child, Beatrice Philo, a widow visiting relatives, 37-year-old Madame Chapadeau with her infant boy and 2 teenage children, 14-year-old Florette and 13-year-old Jean-Claude. Madame Durette from Baie Trinité, high school PE teacher Harold Pye, and Madame Rita Guay, en route to collect 2 cases of jewellery in Baie-Comeau. Rescuers and the Quebec Provincial Police combed the wreckage and began the ghastly task of collecting human remains to be carried off the hillside. Though the site of the wreckage was remote, nearly 7 miles of thick forest between it and the nearest highway, it didn't deter reporters, gawkers, and frantic loved ones of those on board from attempting to descend the steep slope to the crash site. Among them was Joseph Albert Guay, who'd driven from Quebec to Cap Tourmente in the hopes of locating his wife, passenger Rita Guay. By the time he arrived, police had established a perimeter around the wreck to keep looters and macabre souvenir hunters away. By the following morning, the crash of Flight 108 was international news. Canadian Pacific Airlines had not had a single passenger fatality in any of its air routes since its formation in 1942, and, fearing potential lawsuits, was eager to determine the cause of the horrific wreck as soon as possible. Their yearning for this information was shared by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Department of Transport, and the Provincial Police. Early on, investigators theorized that the cause of the explosion may have been a defect in the plane's components, but as they found more of the DC-3, this theory was soon ruled out. The bodies of the 4 crew members were autopsied to determine if some mass illness was to blame, but nothing unusual was found. Investigators were further mystified by the presence of a dynamite-like smell at the crash site, despite dynamite not being listed as cargo for the flight. It wouldn't be until the 1970s that civil aircraft became regular targets for hijackings and terrorist attacks, and so while the smell of dynamite at the scene would be seen as a proverbial smoking gun today, this wasn't the case in the 1940s. Analysis of the wreckage determined that the explosion originated in the forward baggage compartment, since the passenger seated closest to the compartment, Henri Paul Bouchard, was blasted nearly 300 feet from the wreckage and not found until September the 16th. Baggage compartment number 1 contained only the luggage and parcels loaded at l'Ancien Lorette, of which there were only a handful. The cargo manifest for that luggage compartment listed 3 valises, 2 typewriters and 3 Air Express packages. As the investigation unfolded, the loved ones of the passengers and crew set about the grisly business of burying their dead and saying their final goodbyes. Rita Gay's funeral was held at Saint Roch Church, and her grieving husband, Joseph Albert, purchased a 5-foot cross of red roses with a heart of white roses at the centre, bearing the inscription, "From your beloved Albert." Another wreath, bought in his daughter's name, was placed atop Rita's lavish $800 casket. Investigators matched the suitcases and typewriters to passengers who'd made the same flight 2 days earlier, when there was not enough room for all of the baggage. One of the Air Express packages contained automobile parts, another lingerie. The third was a 25-pound parcel, contents unspecified, shipped from Delphine Bouchard of Saint-Simeon to Alfred Plouffe of Baie-Comeau. But investigators found no record of an Alfred Plouffe in Baie-Comeau, and Delphine Bouchard said he knew nothing of the package. The only clue was a witness statement from the baggage clerk at Quebec Airport, who said a nervous, dark-haired woman in her 40s had arrived in a taxi shortly before Flight 108 was scheduled to depart. After dropping off the heavy parcel, the woman departed in the same taxi cab. Using the detailed records of Quebec's taxi drivers, investigators determined that on the morning of September the 9th, only one had made a round trip to the airport with a woman and a package. Driver Paul-Henri Pelletier told investigators that he remembered his passenger well, from the way she'd seemed overly careful with her package, and admonished his driving to her 55-cent tip. Pelletier was able to take investigators to the apartment house where he'd collected the dark-haired woman, and he was able to identify her when she eventually emerged from the building. Her name was Marguerite Pitre, a rough-and-tumble 41-year-old woman who worked on and off as a waitress, took in boarders, and allegedly performed abortions for desperate friends and neighbours. In his impatience to break the story about the mysterious package, taxi driver Paul-Henri Pelletier contacted a reporter at Le Canada, a French-language Montreal paper. While not naming Mrs. Pitre, he told the paper that the police were pursuing a suspect who had delivered a strange package to the airport on the morning of the plane crash. Shortly after, Marguerite Pitre was found semi-conscious at her home following an overdose of sleeping pills. On September 23, the recovered Pitre was questioned by police. She told them she had delivered the package to the airport at the request of Joseph Albert Guay. a close friend who was 9 years her junior and who she considered to be like a son to her. Pitre claimed not to know what was in the package and said she believed it contained some kind of religious statue. Pitre was held on charges of attempting suicide, which was illegal at the time. It would later be revealed that Guay had supplied Mrs. Pitre with the pills, suggesting that she take her life and full blame for the entire incident. Joseph Albert Guay was having dinner at his mother-in-law's house when he heard the radio broadcast about Mrs. Pitre's arrest. According to his mother-in-law, he stood up, banged his hand on the table and shouted, "Damned slut," before hastily departing for his mother's house in Limoilou. He was arrested the following morning and taken to the Quebec men's jail while the Crown built a case against him. The story that emerged was more horrific than any prosecutor could have imagined. Joseph Albert Guay was born in 1918 and grew up in one of Quebec City's roughest neighborhoods. In this coarse environment, Guay developed into a small-time hustler who took to calling himself J. Albert. During the Second World War, he worked at a government munitions factory while selling watches and jewellery of questionable quality on the side. Every penny he earned went into creating his persona as a suave man about town. He purchased fancy suits and bought himself a Mercury automobile to impress the many eligible young ladies also spending their war years at l'Arsenal de Saint-Malo. It paid off in 1941 when he married a big-eyed brunette named Rita Morel. The newlyweds settled in the lower town section of Quebec, an unsavoury area along the river. Fellow l'Arsenal employee Marguerite Pitre lived nearby and befriended the handsome newlywed who flattered her with his affections. Guay eventually left the Arsenal and became a full-time jewellery salesman, relocating with Rita to Sept-Îles. They had a daughter named Lise in 1945, and Guay supported the small family by travelling up and down the St. Lawrence River, peddling engagement rings, crucifixes and watches. He also collected watches that needed repair, which he sent to Marguerite Pitre's brother, Généreux Ruest, a skilled watchmaker who had a workshop in his apartment. Gay's sales, mostly made on installment plans, didn't generate the sort of income he hoped for. In addition to his financial struggles, Guay was frustrated with Rita's new role as a mother, which consumed all of her time and attention. During a trip to Quebec City in 1947, Guay met a waitress named Marie-Ange Robitaille, and the pair began an illicit affair. Marie-Ange told Guay she was 19, but she was only 17 when they met. And while she knew Guay was married and had a daughter, the pair told her parents he was a young bachelor named Roger Angers. Perhaps desiring to be closer to his new lady, he moved his family back to Lower Town in early 1948 and opened a store there. Between running his business and posing as a devoted husband and father, Guay paid twice weekly visits to Marie-Ange's family home, pretending to be an earnest suitor courting the Robitaille's young daughter. But the ruse ended in November 1948 when Rita, who'd overheard neighborhood gossip about her husband's teenage girlfriend, showed up at the Robitaille's house and told the young girl's parents the truth. Shortly after Rita's dramatic visit, Marie-Ange contacted Guay and told him she'd been kicked out of her parents' house. Guay asked Marguerite Pitre if she would take in the homeless teen, and Pitre agreed. For months, Marie-Ange pretended to be living in Montreal to keep her parents at bay. By early 1949, she was tired of being kept in the shadows and decided to finally end the affair and return home. According to her, Guay got wind of her plan and held her against her will, biting her face several times in an effort to embarrass her into staying put. In April, Joseph approached a family friend and offered him $500 to kill his wife, suggesting that the would-be assassin poisoned her with a bottle of cherry wine. The friend turned the offer down, but didn't tell Rita about the plot. In June, she took leave, moved in with her mother, Mrs. Morel, and got a job waitressing. Shortly after being left by both his wife and mistress, Joseph accosted Marie-Ange at gunpoint and threatened to kill them both. He was arrested and charged with attempted assault with a deadly weapon. But Mrs. Pitre used her lower town connections to hire a lawyer who managed to wrangle the charge down to carrying a gun illegally, which required only the payment of a $25 fine. Days later, he convinced Marie-Ange to accompany him to Montreal and then to Sept-Îles to establish a home together. But within a week, the pair were quarrelling again, and the young girl left him and returned to Quebec City. Flustered, Joseph believed that the only way to keep hold of her was marriage. But he thought Rita was unlikely to grant him a divorce, and his well-known history of adultery precluded him from being able to sue for one. Instead, he determined that his best course of action was to kill Rita in a way that disguised his involvement completely. After an appropriate period of mourning, he could marry Marie-Ange without tarnishing his reputation. As he had so many times before, he turned to Marguerite Pitre for help. Both Mrs. Pitre and her brother were struggling financially. Marguerite owed Guay $600, which he promised to forgive if she assisted him with his wicked act. Ruest had just learned a woman he'd been casually dating was pregnant, and she wanted some $300 from him to go away quietly. Guay suggested he could pay the woman and agreed to cut 50% off the price of a ring Ruest wanted to buy for another of his lovers. Together, the three hatched a plan. In early August, Joseph Albert Guay took a boat to Baie-Comeau, where he stored 2 suitcases full of jewellery in a warehouse after a failed attempt to sell them. Meanwhile, he moved into Mrs. Morel's house with Rita and Lise, pretending to be a husband desperate for reconciliation with his wife and daughter. Marguerite purchased 20 half-pound sticks of dynamite, 15 detonating caps, and a 30-foot length of fuse under a false name, telling the clerk they were for blasting tree stumps. Ruest put his watchmaking skills to use as he and Guay constructed a timed detonating mechanism using an alarm clock and a dry cell battery. Mrs. Pitre suggested that they enlist the help of a neighbourhood cab driver in their scheme under the guise of a night out. They could place the bomb in the trunk of the taxi, and at some point Joseph and the cab driver could feign car trouble, leaving Rita in the vehicle while they went for help. The taxi driver Mrs. Pitre had in mind was less than enthusiastic about destroying his own cab, so Guay decided to place the explosive on an airplane instead. He convinced Rita to fly to Baie-Comeau and retrieve the 2 suitcases he'd left there. He purchased his wife a round-trip ticket and a $10,000 flight insurance policy, naming himself as beneficiary. Then he instructed Ruest to set the timing device for 10:45 on September the 9th, when the Canadian Pacific flight would be flying over the St. Lawrence River, information he'd quietly collected during his own flight on the same route with Marie-Ange in July. On the morning of the flight, Joseph Albert Guay collected the bomb from Ruest. The men packaged it in brown paper and chose 2 random names for the addresses. Guay then took the bomb to the railway station, where he handed it off to Marguerite. She delivered the bomb to the cargo counter at the airport, while Joseph rushed home to escort Rita to the Château Frontenac, where she hired a taxi to take her the rest of the way to the airport. Guay had counted on Flight 108 crashing into the St. Lawrence River and destroying all traces of the homemade bomb. But because of the plane's late departure, it crashed into the side of Cape Tourmente, creating a crime scene rich with evidence that quickly led investigators first to Marguerite and in turn Joseph Albert Guay. His trial began on February 24, 1950. The defendant only showed emotion when Mariage took the stand and testified that she no longer loved him. Guay was eventually found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. He spent the time before his execution not appealing his own sentence, but ensuring Marguerite Pitre and General Ruest, who'd both testified against him, earned the same punishment. The condemned man penned lengthy statements for use in both trials, each ending in convictions. On January the 12th, 1951, Joseph Albert Guay was hanged at Montreal's Bordeaux Common Jail. Ruest was escorted to the same gallows on July the 24th, 1952, and Marguerite Pitre on January the 9th, 1953, when she became the last woman to ever be hanged in Canada. Up until her death, Pitre maintained her innocence, claiming she knew nothing of Gay's plans and had only agreed to deliver the package because he promised to forgive her debt. Even today, many believe the evidence tying her to the plot was circumstantial at best. 3 days after the last convicted murderer was executed, Canadian Pacific Airways dismantled the long-protected site of the crash and shipped most of the wreckage of Flight 108 to a scrapyard, though there are remnants at the site to this day. The explosion, contrived and carried out by Guay and his accomplices, remained the largest mass murder in Canadian history until 1985, when Air India Flight 182 exploded over the Atlantic Ocean, killing 329 people, 268 of whom were Canadian. The tragic story of Canadian Pacific Flight 108 is a haunting reminder of how far some are willing to go to satisfy their darkest desires. What should have been a routine flight became the scene of a meticulously planned act of betrayal and murder, driven by a need to fulfill a dangerous obsession. Though justice was served, the devastation left in its wake, innocent lives lost, families shattered, and a nation shaken, remains a scar on Canadian history. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.